And now, we welcome you back to Third Phase of Moon Radio. I'm your host, Dr. J, with Blake Cousins, and for the 100,000 subscribers to Third Phase of Moon, we have an amazing show for you today. We have a debate going back a question from decades, if not millennia. Are we alone in the universe? But more importantly, now that the Kepler telescope is finding so many planets, the question is, are these UFOs people are seeing inhabited by extraterrestrials? That's the question. To debate this, we have the flying saucer physicist, Mr. Stanton Friedman. Mr. Friedman, you there?
I'm here in beautiful Fredericton, New Brunswick, Canada, where it's raining.
And we also have famed skeptic and debunker, Mr. Robert Schaefer. Mr. Schaefer, how are you?
I'm doing just fine. I'm near San Diego, and it's sunny and warm.
Joining me in this moderation is the founder of Third Phase Moon, Blake Cousins. Blake, how are you today?
We're doing good right here in the sunny state of Hawaii. Sorry, guys, but it's nice and blue, and we're looking forward to this great debate. Are we alone in the universe? Can't wait to get started.
So this is what we're going to do. Mr. Friedman, we're going to go with opening statements with you first. Then, Mr. Schaefer, we're going to have you respond with your own opening statement. And then we'll talk about general topics and just go back and forth. Go ahead, Mr. Friedman.
Okay, after, since 1958, that's 55 years, I've reached four major conclusions about flying saucers. And I much prefer the term because all flying saucer UFOs, but not all UFOs are flying saucers. Just like all great-grandfathers are men, but not all men are great-grandfathers. I happen to be one, as a matter of fact. But I don't get extra points for that, I don't think. Four major conclusions. One, the evidence is overwhelming that Earth is being visited by intelligently controlled extraterrestrial spacecraft. In other words, some, underlined 37 times, some UFOs are alien spacecraft. Most are not. Just like most isotopes aren't fissionable. If I want to build a reactor, I use the ones that are. Secondly, we're dealing with what I call a cosmic Watergate. That is to say, some few people within major governments have known since at least 1947 that indeed some UFOs are alien spacecraft. Now, notice, I didn't say everybody in government knows. That's not how you keep secrets. I spent 14 years in industry working on classified programs. There's the need to know, an appropriate clearance. It isn't easy to find out what's going on. The third conclusion is there are no good arguments against the first two conclusions. And the fourth is we're dealing with the biggest story of the millennium. Visits to planet Earth by alien spacecraft, successful cover-up of the best data, bodies, and wreckage. For 66 years, I guess now. And also I've concluded that there are four basic rules used by debunkers, not just about UFOs, but about any subject they want to debunk. And there's plenty of debunking going on in the world. I even join in on some of it. First, don't bother me with the facts my mind's made up. Second, what the public doesn't know, I'm not going to tell them. Third, do your research by proclamation. Investigation is too much trouble. And fourth, I have forgotten, so we'll leave that one out.
Mr. Schaefer, you just made 5 things right there. Is there anything you'd like to respond to all those on top of your...
Well, I don't want to do a point-by-point thing here. First, I just want to say I was surprised to learn that the topic of this debate is supposed to be, are we alone in the universe? I don't believe we are alone in the universe. I've never said that we are alone in the universe. And in fact, I consider that idea to be the prime UFO fallacy. Whenever I say to a group of people that, I don't believe that these UFO reports that are coming in, that there anything extraterrestrial about them, or that there are any extraterrestrials here, then very often they will say in a very forceful and kind of confrontational way, well, what makes you so sure we're the only people in the universe? I said, I never said that. I'm not claiming that at all. This universe is an enormously vast place. And, if you just think of how far, if you were a light beam and you were traveling out and you travel for years and years at the speed of light, You're only at the nearby stars. You know, you haven't even gotten anywhere. You travel 50,000 years. Think of how much, you know, what happened. I mean, think of what was going on 50,000 years ago. That light beam's traveling 50,000 years. Still hasn't even left our galaxy. And there's so many galaxies. So I would never say there's nobody out there. But what I would say is that there's no credible evidence of any visitations of extraterrestrials here to the Earth. Now, to touch on one of the points that Stanton brought up about, you know, the cosmic Watergate and so on, and they're keeping these secrets from us, one of the examples that Stanton has been using in his lectures, people say government can't keep a secret. Stanton is arguing that they can, and his example is the Corona project, which was the very first spy satellite project, and it began in, I think, the late 50s and early 60s, in the very early days of the space age, and it wasn't declassified until 1995, and so Stanton has given this as an example of government being able to keep a secret. Stanton, it's too bad you didn't read a book by your old buddy Philip J. Klass, Secret Sentries in Space. He has chapter 10. It's about the Discoverer satellites. He doesn't just talk about the program being there. He talks about how, he tells each launch which ones were successful, which ones made it into orbit, which ones successfully deployed their cameras, their film. It's, he's got so much detail there. This was published in 1971. And so, if you want to choose an example of supposedly how the government can keep a secret, that is a very bad example, because you simply
Did you say Discoverer?
Yes.
Did I hear you right?
Yes.
Okay.
If you go into Wikipedia, if you go to Wikipedia and you type in Discoverer, it forwards to Corona. The one thing they did keep secret apparently was the name of the project. But if every one of these satellites of that project is discussed here, and this is why Philip Klass, the late Phil Klass, who of course was a very high-profile UFO skeptic, died about 5-6 years back. He was adamant that there was no cover-up or anything in Washington in the government, because if there were, he said he has so many of the contacts and people leaking things to him. I mean, that's Aviation Week. That's like the original WikiLeaks. And so he was quite certain that there was no cover-up, because he found out about everything else. He found out about this Corona project, and he found out about the Stealth project and everything while it was still secret. But nothing has ever leaked out about UFOs.
Well, that shows how negligent he was in his research. It's very simple and straightforward. The kicker here is most Americans, well, most people in the world, I guess it's a small world anymore, have no idea how big the black budgets have been over the years for the NRO and the NSA and the OSI. And, I get a kick out of, now let Phil rest in peace for a moment. There are other things to be said about him. And I will call him an honest man in the sense that he paid his debt. He challenged me about one of the MJ-12 documents, and when I proved him wrong, he paid his debt. So I'll give him credit for that. I could use the $1,000, but secrets are being kept all the time. Now, I'll admit, it wasn't a question of Dr. Tyson, for example, who says the proof that we can't keep secrets is how much we know about President Clinton's genitalia, which hardly has anything to do with the NRO, NSC, et cetera, et cetera.
No, but he would be trying hard to keep that secret, I'll tell you. what he's doing with him.
I would hope, well, I expect so. Let's put it that way. I don't have intimate personal knowledge of that. Another example of people making strange claims about cover-up, Dr. Seth Shostak claimed that the proof that there can't be any cover-up is how bad a job FEMA did on Katrina and how badly the post office is run, neither of which has anything at all to do with the question of black budgets, secrets, all those alphabet soup agencies.
Right, but you've been talking about the black budget, and I agree with you. There's an awful lot there, but where is the proof that any of it, even 1 cent of it, has to do with UFOs?
Well, if we look, it's very easy to find that UFOs are part of that story. Look at the 156 whited out NSA, National Security Agency. I know you know what that means, but not necessarily.
Yes, I know.
What against. 156 NSA UFO documents that were released, it says here, way back in the early 80s, after a Freedom of Information Act suit and all kinds of legal shenanigans. And you can read 1 sentence per page. Everything else is whited out, and it's whited out instead of blacked out, I was told by the NSA, because Phil Klass, whom we were just talking about, said that I show some blacked out documents and don't tell people it's what would you call it? It's sources and methods information that's being kept back. Now, don't tell me 98% of a document is sources and methods, and the other 2% is about UFOs. It's filed.
Well, if it allows you to tell where the message came from or where it was intercepted from, then it would be sources and methods. The NSA issued a statement that says the comment reports being withheld from the plaintiff are all based on intercepted foreign communications. The disclosure of these records would identify the communications that had been successfully intercepted and processed for intelligence purposes.
Are you saying that the Russians didn't notice that we were listening?
Well, they don't know what we were listening. They don't know how much we were, snooping on them and what we had successfully decoded. You got to keep them guessing on that.
Well, it's a game that's played all the time. I'll grant you. There's a big budget that goes into playing that game, not only with CIA. But it's interesting, the CIA blacks out its documents. there are some you can read 6 words on. I mean, how very generous of them that it took me 5 years to get CIA UFO documents by their estimate. But even beyond that, let's look at the work of General Bolander, Carol Bolander. He was given the unenviable task, I guess, of deciding what the United States Air Force should do about Project Blue Book. He was an Air Force general. He had nothing previously to do with UFOs. He worked on the lunar excursion module. We landed on the moon, and as he told me when I talked to him 10 years later, for once he didn't have to work 12-hour days. Anyway, he gave an appraisal of Project Blue Book, which, according to all the official statements, was the government organization concerned with UFOs. The only one, as a matter of fact. And in October of 1969, he issued is not quite the word. It was an inside document, not an outside one. A memo in which he said we should close Project Blue Book. He said reports of UFOs, which could affect national security, are made in accordance with JNAP, Joint Army Navy Air Force Publication 146, or Air Force Manual 55-11, and are not part of the Blue Book system, which is a rather extraordinary statement. 2 paragraphs later, he goes on to say, if we close Project Blue Book, the public won't have any place to report UFO sightings. However, as previously noted, reports which could affect national security will continue to be investigated using the procedures designed for that purpose. Now, since 1969, I spoke with General Bolander, incidentally. He's dead now, so you can't go. Well, maybe some people who are listening can find him, but I don't know where. I spoke with him. The example I used, I said, gee, it sounds like you're saying there are 2 separate channels of communication here. Ones which affect security and the other stuff. He said, yes. The example I cited, a saucer going down the runway at a Strategic Air Command base where nuclear weapons were stored. That's a national security problem because there's not supposed to be anybody there besides our guys. And he said, yes. Now, the press has never told the public that, oh, the good stuff didn't go to Project Blue Book. It's about time they did. Where's the New York Times when you need it? And I wouldn't object if the debunkers would tell the public that indeed there are sightings that didn't go through Project Blue Book, even though we were constantly told at the end of every year when the overview came out that, no national security concerns here.
I think we're talking about, things where there were sightings on bases and things like that. But nobody has ever shown any evidence that there was any organized project to do anything with any sporadic reports that might come in from elsewhere in the military. I think they realized that if anything came in from the public, it was likely to be of very little value. That the so-called reliable witnesses are not reliable as such. In fact, I have an example of that here I'd like to talk about, and this was a UFO sighting from 1996 that occurred in the Yukon, and on the evening of December 11th of 1996, there were more than 30 people in several different locations in Canada's sparsely populated Yukon territories. Reported seeing a huge UFO mothership with rows of lights, and there was the documentary film Best Evidence, Top 10 UFO Sightings by Paul Kimball, who was your nephew or something like that.
Yes.
And lists this as number 8 of the top 10. And in that film, you appear and you're saying how this is emblematic of what a good case should be and so on. I don't need to go into all that. But as you perhaps are aware, I think just within the last 6 months or so, Ted Molyneux, who is the world's top civilian expert on Earth satellites and orbits and things like that, looked into the matter very carefully and came up with an exact match. The observed phenomena were due to the reentry of the second stage of the rocket that placed Cosmos 2335 into orbit earlier the same day.
No way, Jose.
Well,
no way, Jose.
You can say that, but now on my blog,
I've got
all this stuff, and it doesn't matter if I'm just saying that if enter Yukon in the search box on bad UFOs, and the thing will come up with all the pictures that people saw, they think they saw, but again, the human eye is not a precise recording device, and especially when people are excited. And this brilliant UFO, so-called, which really was the re-entry of Cosmos 2335 rocket booster, matched exactly with the position and the time where people were claiming that they were seeing this.
Not according to Martin Jasik's report. He is a civil engineer. He did a triangulation of these, 30 sets of witnesses. They're not individuals. Usually they were couples. You can understand when you're up in that part of the world.
Yeah.
No way does it match the satellite re-entry. Lasted much longer than that, for example. And I'd recommend look up Martin Jasik's report, Jacek. Good engineer, spent time with them, very impressed. That's a typical example of don't bother me with the facts, my mind's made up. Here's a possible explanation. It must be the right explanation. It's a possible explanation. And remember the basic rule. ABA, anything but alien. If the first explanation doesn't work, try a second one. If that doesn't work, try a third one and keep going. Because we know it can't be anything strange.
You shouldn't start with the least likely explanation, which is extraterrestrial. I think
that's the most likely explanation. Remember that the size of the object by triangulation was between 0.6 and 1.2 miles long. Now, that's pretty darn big, at least. Well, the Yukon is a big place with not many people, I'll grant you that.
But if you look at I have the drawings on my blog. One was from the witness who shows this UFO, so-called, passing under the Big Dipper from left to right, and then I have the software-generated map by Ted Molyneux showing its position of the rocket booster, and it went under the Big Dipper from left to right. I'm trying to understand what you're saying here. Are you saying that there was no satellite reentry, or are you saying that the UFO hovered in between the observer and the satellite so that they couldn't see this brilliant satellite burning up in the sky behind the UFO?
How long was it observed for?
I don't recall exactly.
Martin's sightings covered a long period of time, but that's a good example. And admittedly, there were no alien beings, ETs, or anything associated with this directly. At least I didn't see any report in Martin's report of beings being spotted on this huge thing. Call it what you want. But that's a good case and a very careful investigation by somebody who was there and talked to loads of people. And if they can get the report, I don't know if it's still available, to tell you the truth.
I think it's online somewhere. In fact, I might even have a link to it on there.
It should be online. Everything else is, for goodness sake.
Yeah.
You know.
But the point is, if a thing like this can make it as one of the top 10 cases, it just shows you how wobbly all this stuff is. Because you have to believe that there was this amazing, extraordinary extraterrestrial vehicle hovering right there next to where this satellite was burning up.
I didn't say anything about that. It moved around. You know, it's typical.
Then why didn't they see the satellite? Why? I mean, they should have seen two strange things happening there. You know, they should have seen the rocket burning up and the UFO. Instead, they just see one thing and say, "Oh, it's a big mothership." Well, it's an example of how reliable witnesses, so-called, really aren't, and that the human mind plays tricks on you. Especially, it's like a Rorschach blot.
Every lawyer will tell you that you got to be careful about eyewitness testimony. There's no question about that. It's not perfect. Not many things in life are. On the other hand, when you start looking at quality evaluations of reports by professional people evaluating the quality, such as in my favorite document, Blue Book Special Report 14.
Report number 14, yes.
Yeah, and I'm sure you're aware of it, Bob, so I'm not accusing you of not being aware of it. Now, my University of Chicago classmate Carl Sagan didn't seem to be aware of it because he made the strange statement twice that there are interesting sightings that aren't reliable, and we both agree with that, as a matter of fact.
Yeah.
I think, and there are reliable sightings that aren't interesting. We probably both agree about that. But his conclusion was that there are no interesting and reliable sightings, which he supported with nothing, not a reference, not any data, and which Blue Book Special Report 14 showed was not true. The more reliable the sighting, the more likely to be unexplainable. Now, I realize it's part of your view that there aren't any sightings that are reliable, that can't be identified. Matter of fact, as you said years ago, it is evident that the UFO phenomenon consists of nothing more than misperceptions, hoaxes, and hysteria. UFOs exist only in the overheated imagination of the UFO sighters and investigators. That's totally untrue if you look at, say, Blue Book Special Report 14, or the Condon Report, or the UFO evidence, or the testimony of the 12 scientists, most of the 12 scientists at the congressional hearings of 1968.
Gentlemen, we're coming to our first short break. Everybody stay tuned. Third Phase of the Moon Radio. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Third Phase of the Moon Radio. I'm your host, Dr. J, and we have an amazing debate for you today. Just before we went on break, Stanton Friedman, flying saucer physicist, is debating the famed skeptic and debunker Robert Schaefer on the question of, are extraterrestrials visiting Earth, and have they been? Before we go back to what you were saying, Mr. Friedman, I know Blake Cousins had a comment. Go ahead, Blake.
The show's amazing. Let's just get back to national security. The Manhattan Project was completed. 100,000 people, American citizens, worked on this project, the atomic weapon. They didn't know what was going on. It was a secret. Nobody knew where A to Z went, but they knew they were on a mission. Secrets are being kept from the U.S. Citizens here. 14 guys with box cutters changed the world, 9/11, and now there's a secret government going on with a black budget. Who created these guys? What's it all about? They have no recourse to answer to anybody of what they're doing. Why is this happening? We don't know, but secrets are being held. We know stories for a fact get suppressed because the people with power and money will suppress the story. It's not a joke. This is real. It happens every single day. Power suppresses information. That's one of the comments I had to say. Looking forward to the debate, guys. Keep it up.
Mr. Friedman, right before we went on break, you were talking about a hearing from 1968. I want to let you go ahead and finish your comment before we go to Mr. Schaefer. Go ahead, Mr. Friedman.
Oh, okay. In 1968, the House Committee on Science and Aeronautics had hearings on UFO. They had testimony from 6 witnesses live, in person, that is, and 6 more of us in writing only. I was the youngest of the group, and maybe the only survivor. I haven't checked recently. And I was the only one of the group without a PhD. And the written testimony is available. And if you look on my website, www.stantonfriedman.com, you can find James E. McDonald's paper, which has information on 41 separate sightings that could not be explained and that he personally investigated. Now, I will say this, the congressman who put this whole business together, his reward was being gerrymandered out of his district in the next election. It tells you something, I guess. And
well, maybe not cause and effect, but who knows?
Well, I don't know,
yeah.
but it was a coincidence. I'll even accept that, maybe. Another good example of security, you mentioned the Manhattan Project. What I get a kick out of was they built the gaseous diffusion plant at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and it was a mile long, and it used 5% of the electrical power of the United States. That's why it was in Tennessee. They had TVA and they had power to burn, if you'll pardon the expression, and all in secret. Now, one that I get a kick out of is the breaking of the German code. At World War II. It's very important to the United States, to the Allies, that we knew the German military communication back and forth from Hitler and all over the place. Now, you'd think when the war was over that they would have said, hey, look what we did. And during the war, there were 12,000 people at Bletchley Park in England whose job it was to intercept, decode, translate, and very carefully release the German military communications. The care was necessary because if the Germans found out that we'd broken the code, they'd have changed it and we'd have been in serious trouble. Now, you'd think they'd have announced it right at the end of the war because it truly was very important to know where the German military guys were going and all that stuff. Instead, it was more than 25 years after the war before it was announced that we had done that. The reason, incidentally, nothing terribly subtle. There were other people using the coding machines, and we were listening to their conversations too, basically, and we didn't want them to know it. But 12,000 people, the war was over. None of them spoke up. So this has nothing to do with what we're talking about here in the sense of who thinks they can keep secrets or not, but only that we know that there were people who didn't open their mouth despite knowing something of extraordinary significance during the war.
Well, and during the war, like you said, and immediately after, obviously, the other people, like you said, were using these things. There was a reason to keep that secret. And you said 25 years. Okay, how long has it been since Kenneth Arnold? Is that 65 years? 66 years, something like that. In other words, the UFO sightings have been going on for 66 years now, and we still don't have any leaks or anything like that would prove anything. So if this this is far beyond any. Well, if you're going to claim MJ12 or something, I wanted to go back to you were talking about Special Report 14. Well, now Alan Hendry, a blast from the past, in his book UFO Handbook, 1979. Alan Hendry was one of Dr. Hynek's colleagues at QFOS, and he was too good of a researcher, and he was too successful at solving cases, and I guess that's ticked off a bunch of people, and they ran him out of town, so to speak, on a rail.
No, they ran out of money is what happened.
Well, that may be, but he got a very bitter taste in his mouth and won't have anything to do with UFOs since. But anyway, he wrote this analysis of Blue Book Special Report 14 that you said proves that the certain the unidentified cases are better than the identified ones or something. But he's pointing out how loose these criteria were, and his comment is, if the Battelle group had a real appreciation for how loose the data were, they never would have bothered with a statistical comparison to begin with. So, and he goes on for 4 or 5 pages and explains that, when you use chi-squared tests, you have to have, exact, the formulae are supposed to be absolute, which these are not. So it's not as good as the statistics that you were talking about here. Not everybody is as convinced as you that they are proving anything. Now, you said,
I would agree with that. I agree with you, Bob. Not everybody is convinced as I am.
Right.
I agree with you about more than one thing, Bob. And
that's good to know. That's good to know.
May shock our listeners, but let me read something here. This is a comment that you made recently, I guess this was. When you talk about a particular report, you say, this is one of the best documented UFO books I've ever seen. There are documents from the FBI archives, the Air Force archives, documents, news clippings, and most important, the documents from the Frank Scully collection of the American Heritage Center at the University of Wyoming that no researcher previously realized existed.
That's correct.
Including me. And I agree
talking about the Aztec incident here, the new book on this old saucer crash hoax in the Frank Scully book, which was a sensationalist thing based on the story by the two con men of Gebauer and Silas Newton, who were the sources.
If people read the book, they'll see that there was much more. The story, incidentally, the authors' names are Scott and Suzanne Ramsey. And as you point out correctly in your overview, they spent a ton of money and time and effort. Good people, sharp people. And I agree with your appraisal of the book. It's an outstanding book. And I appreciate that you stuck your neck out.
But the point is, just because I said it's well documented, the point is those documents don't prove anything as far as a saucer crash. They went and got all kinds of statements, arguments back and forth between Frank Scully and J.P. Kahn and everybody else.
Forget about Scully and
which
Gebauer.
are all very interesting, but have nothing to do with. They don't prove anything. They certainly don't prove a saucer crash.
If you get rid of the testimony of Gebauer and Scully, you still are left with an outstanding event, carefully researched by two people who spent a ton of money and time.
Well,
and I don't know of another case. I'm a upholder of the Roswell incident, if you will, but certainly in this case, they went to depths that nobody has gone to about.
Well, it's true. They dug out more documents than anybody else had, and so it's a good contribution for that reason. But that doesn't mean that the conclusion that they're trying to draw is correct. They're trying to whitewash this guy Silas Newton, who was the source for Frank Scully. And they're trying to say, well, he was an honest oil man, he got a bad rap, and so on. That's not what the FBI says. I've got the link there, vault.fbi.gov/Silas-Newton, and it says, and these are FBI records, it says Silas Newton was a wealthy oil producer and con man who claimed that he had a gadget that could detect minerals and oil. He was cited as an authority in Frank Scully's book, Behind the Flying Saucers.
Well, are you forgetting the fact that it was standard practice to use doodle bugs? I don't know where that word came from, frankly, but doodle bugs were part of exploration for iron ore, part of explanation for oil. You got to do some homework, Bob.
So, and he was claiming that microwaves in the ground microwaves are emitted by oil in the ground, and his doodle bug picked them up. Now, do you believe this? What exactly was this thing doing? It was a fraudulent device. You can't. There's nothing that can point and say, here's oil, here's gold, here's silver.
No. That's not what doodle bugs were used. They were flown by an airplane, altitude of about 1,000 feet, varied a bit. And you measure the signals. It was also used to detect submarines during the war.
Well, we
didn't advertise that very loudly.
Yeah. Well, all that means is you can detect iron with a magnet. Everybody knows that.
And oil.
Oil in the ground.
Oil.
Well,
look it up. I got an article in front of me.
But the point is, if you look at the claims that this guy was making, and if he wasn't up in an airplane, he was down on the ground, he was in a car driving around and saying, "Oh, here's silver, and here's this, and here's that."
That's an overstatement of what he was saying, Bob. And you know.
Well, you read the book, the Behind the Flying Saucers. That's in there. This Dr. G, so-called, who was the source of it all, Leo Jabauer, he was claimed to be a top scientist, and
he wasn't the source of it all.
Well, yes, he was.
He's a composite of half a dozen people.
Well, that's
and
what
Scully put them together. That's one of the things that Scott and Suzanne did was dig out.
That's what they claim, but they didn't. Yeah, but there's no real evidence of that. Again, it's just
well, they don't have a live person going public, and I noticed in your encyclopedia contribution, in effect, you're saying, "Gee, we don't have a saucer in hand." We, meaning us outside the classification barriers. And I would agree with you. I don't have a piece of it. Anybody asks me, and I've been asked this, would you believe, what's the skin of the saucer made of? I don't know. Nobody's sending me classified reports about that stuff. The fact that I don't have those reports doesn't mean they don't exist.
So you think that somebody somewhere in the government has these things? You're convinced of that? Yeah, that's right. You're convinced of at least the first three of the MJ-12 documents, the first three of, what is it, more than 100 and something now, but at least...
It's over 100 anyway.
Yeah. The first three, I think, came from a different hoaxer than the next set did. But
look, your buddy Phil Klass appreciated my research so much, he paid me $1,000 for proving him wrong about the typeface.
That's true. It was a highly technical argument about the typeface that was used on authentic documents, and as it turned out, Klass was wrong about that. But that's just a peripheral issue. The important thing is this: you got these three documents, okay, the Truman-Forrestal memo, supposedly Truman's signature, but the Truman signature on that is a photocopy of a genuine Truman signature. Nobody's signature is ever identical twice, absolutely identical. These you can overlay to show that somebody simply photocopied that. Then
Phil said that and referred to a reference that he was way out of date many years earlier about. As a matter of fact, that same volume said that you can have identical signatures, but not consecutively. And as a matter of fact, Truman, in a comment to, I think it was his sister, after the 48 election, which, as you may recall, he surprised a lot of people by winning, he was signing thank you notes, and he was signing hundreds and hundreds of them. And I would bet you anything you'll find identical signatures there.
But these were not thank you notes. These were documents in the Truman archives in the library there. So that one appears to be fake for that reason. Now, the second one of your favorites, the Eisenhower briefing document, references the earlier document, the supposedly earlier document, Truman before Eisenhower. So if the Eisenhower document is a hoax because it references the Truman with the fake signature, then the Cutler Twining memo that allegedly was found in the archive, but it had no archive registration number. The archive says this document, the so-called document, is a hoax, and investigation.
Wait a minute now.
That the date that Cutler allegedly wrote the memo, he was out of the country.
Yes, of course he was, and it doesn't have his signature on it. You got to read my book. Well, you don't have to. I presume you have already, but all our listeners, Top Secret Magic. I go into the arguments against each of those three documents, and I show, you must admit, I showed that there are a number of other fake documents, and I was quite clear about that. And with the help of archivists, I didn't do this on my own, and one of them is this business of a control number on a top secret document. I was accused of, Stan, don't you realize that all top secret documents have to have control numbers on them? Well, I talked to two archivists, Eisenhower Library and Marshall Archives, and both of them said, we've got loads of top secret documents that don't have control.
Yeah, but when they put them into archives, the archive registers which, documents
not with
come in.
Control numbers. We were talking specifically about this situation. Can you have a top secret document that doesn't have a control number on it? And the answer is it depends. If you've got 20 copies of it, there's a distribution list, in other words, and you have to inventory the whole business, and you have to have a control number on it. If you have a memo from General A to General B, you don't need to have a control number, and I have examples of them, and the archives will produce examples for you. It's one of those arguments that sounds good until you look at the specifics of it.
Yeah, but I'm not talking about the control number. I'm talking about the archive. When the document goes into the archive, it gets recorded as being in the archive, and it's not recorded. They don't have any document. They don't have any documentation that thing was ever entered into the archive officially. So it probably was just
nobody said the Eisenhower briefing document, EBD. I don't like designations like that, but anyway, because nobody knows what we're talking about. But the EBD wasn't found in the Eisenhower library. It turns up on a roll of film.
No, I'm not talking about the. Yeah, you're not talking about the EBD. I'm talking about the CTM, the one that supposedly was found in the archives. Should have been registered by the archive. Yeah.
I think I have dealt with all the arguments against legitimacy for that in my book and in several articles too, but books are easier to get, I hope, than articles. It's a long, involved story. We're not going to solve it tonight, I guess. But I have found so many objections that don't hold up. And I'm not just talking about Phil's claim about the typeface, a highly technical argument I'd agree with you on, except he came on so strongly. There is a question about that, though. When I tried to look into the Friedman file at the American Philosophical Society Library in Philadelphia, where Phil's papers are,
yeah,
there is no Friedman file. And
well,
we had 20 years.
Make you feel slighted?
No,
and there's no Schaefer file in there either. It's organized, but it's organized by subject. For example, there's a Apache Sitgreaves file having to do with Travis Walton stuff, and then there's other, I forget, but basically it's organized by UFO cases. Yes, by topic.
Right.
Yes.
Whatever.
Anyway.
Okay. Anyway, I asked Phil's wife if there was someplace else where he had donated other of his papers, and she said not so far as she knew. So
I don't think so.
If anybody out there is listening and has any more of Phil's files, I want to see my file, darn it.
Yeah, I have a number of them, and I have scanned them, and I have placed them on my historical on debunker.com. Just look up debunker historical UFO, and you should find it. I've got quite a few papers from him on there, and correspondence back and forth with.
Do you have any from me?
I haven't scanned any yet. There may be some in there, but
let me know.
Yeah, all right.
That will be interesting. The whole question of UFOs is a complicated one because you're dealing with several different things at once. What the government is doing, the fact that parts of the government don't talk to other parts of the government. You write the CIA for their UFO files and they're all blacked out when you get them. And can you trust the government? Let me give you an example of the difficulty I had. And my name isn't John Smith. It's not a common name. I wrote the FBI and the CIA at the same time for my files under Freedom of Information. And I told them, my life history, degrees here and there, my parents' name, date of birth, place of birth, that I had a security clearance for 14 years and so forth. I was trying to make it easy. How many guys with my name were born on the same date in Elizabeth, New Jersey? Not very likely. Anyway, I get back a response from the FBI. We don't have a file on you. At the same time, a little later, actually, a week or two later, I get back a response from the CIA. All we have on you is a negative name check request from the FBI. Just a little squib. They sent me a copy of it. So I write back to the FBI and I say, could you recheck your files, please? This is what I got from the CIA. It would appear that something you have a file on me, or you wouldn't have made such a request. I get back a response from the FBI, a cordial response. We have rechecked our files and find that we do have a file on you. However, it's classified. So I write him again, and I say, I'd like to know the size of the file, because Bill Moore had found out the size of his file years before, and I'd like to know the level of classification. I get back a letter saying, those pieces of information are classified. So we start off by saying, we don't have anything, even though I'd given him the key piece of information that I had a clearance for 14 years. And I know from the friends who were visited by FBI agents that the FBI did it. So we go downhill. We don't have anything. Oh, we do have something, but it's classified, and we can't tell you anything about it.
Well, nowadays they got files on absolutely everybody. The NSA is recording everything. So,
well, yeah, and I suppose Mr. Who's the guy who's in Russia right now? Snowden.
Oh, yeah, Snowden. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, who knows what he's got?
Yeah.
But no, I'll agree with you that there's a bit of a foul up on some classified stuff. And when I was in industry, we had a security guy in one place that I swear thought we were going to invent a magic paint to absorb neutrons and gamma rays. So everything about radiation shielding had to be classified because we might make this great discovery. That's a real pain in the neck. And I should give an example, incidentally. A lot of people don't understand that there's a need-to-know concept here that's important. When I was working on radiation shielding for nuclear airplanes for General Electric, I found in the classified abstracts that the United States Navy, naturally, was working on radiation shielding for nuclear submarines. So I requested some of their reports. I had the right clearance. I had a Q clearance. And I was turned down. They wouldn't give me a need-to-know. I didn't have a need-to-know for that stuff. So I had the right clearance, but Admiral Rickover, whom I'm a great admirer of, still it was a pain in the neck.
Yeah, I also worked on some defense-related projects years ago, and so I know just how all that stuff is done. But none of this proves that anything anywhere is hidden about UFOs. Area 51, you believe there's alien saucers there, reverse engineered?
I have no idea. Certainly, there is stuff being hidden about UFOs unless you have a totally clean version of the NSA documents and of the CIA documents.
Well, you know, gentlemen, we are coming back to another break. Right when we return, Mr. Schaefer, I'll let you take that back up. Everybody stay tuned. Third Phase of Moon Radio. We'll be right back. We are back, Third Phase of Moon Radio live. And just before we go right back into things, I just want to remind everybody that this is the world's largest listener-supported station. Please donate now to continue having shows like this run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Now, we are speaking on a major topic. Are extraterrestrials visiting Earth? On one side, we have the nuclear physicist Stanton Friedman. On the other side, famed skeptic and debunker Robert Schaefer. Just before we went on break, we were talking about Area 51. Mr. Schaefer, you had something to say about that, right?
Well, I didn't really have much to say about that. I just asked Stanton what his thoughts were on this. I mean, we know this is where they developed some of the stealth technology and so on, and we know that some of the UFOs that were being reported there were just airplanes going in and out. They had a commuter airplane that would go from Las Vegas each morning. So nobody lives at, or hardly, well, maybe military people. No civilians live in Area 51, or hardly any, and nobody would want to. Yeah. But we're getting into the second half of the show now, and I want to make sure we leave enough time to talk about the fish map, because this is something that
good idea.
A staple of Stanton's lecture for like the last 40 years. This has to do with an interpretation of a supposed alien star map that Betty Hill allegedly saw while she was on board the flying saucer, and she sketched it afterwards, and a number of people have come up with proposed identifications. In fact, now there's a sixth one, which is called the Wilson Hill map, which I think is at least as wobbly as the others. I haven't had a chance to really go into it in great detail. But the one that has become famous, and in large part because Stanton's been talking about it in all his lectures since 1969 or something like that, is the fish map. The late Marjorie Fish identified supposedly these stars. And the interesting thing is now the fish map was not just, well, here's a region of space, and so here, let's put the stars in there. You had to pick and choose very carefully. They had to all be certain types of stars because they were supposedly stars that would support life, have planets that would support life. So they had to be solar-type stars, main sequence stars. They had to not be double stars unless they were so wide that the one star wouldn't disturb planets of the other, and so on. They should not be variable, and this and that. And then by making all these assumptions, and not assumptions, I mean using the catalog, the Gliese 2 catalog, Marjorie Fish came up with stars that, if you squint in the dark and hold your head sideways, you can almost think that you see a resemblance, although, as has been pointed out many times by Carl Sagan, Stephen Soter, and so on, did a paper on this in the Zeta Reticuli incident. If you draw these same patterns without the lines to suggest a resemblance, you don't see any resemblance at all. That's the good case for the fish map. What's happened now is that in the 40 or almost 50 years since that catalog was assembled, we have much better, more accurate readings, satellite-based measurements, and we now know that there were some very serious errors in the Gliese catalog. And so all these assumptions that you make about what types of stars they are and where they are and so on is, frankly, much of it's wrong now. We know it's wrong. We didn't know that at the time. And so, you know, you take, even though Betty Hill had 26 stars and Marjorie Fish could deal with 16 in her map, well, you got to take out a few because, you know, now we know that some of these were not measured correctly. They do not lie in the volume of space that the fish map supposedly represents. They're much further than we thought they were, so they're out of the picture. Then others are variable. Then a couple more are double, close doubles, and so they're out of the picture. Now, to make it even worse, Zeta 1 and Zeta 2 Reticuli are now known to not be solar-type stars. In fact, they are class 6 stars, which astrophysicists understand what that means. Basically, what it means is they're considered to be subdwarfs. They are not, in other words, they are not solar-type stars. So essentially, with the new data that we have now, we know that whatever was once believed about the fish map, even if you grant everything that Stanton said years ago about the fish map when the Gliese was the best data we had, even if you grant all that, it basically has to just, be blown to pieces because we now know that the data that it's based on was not accurate. So, Stanton, are you still promoting the fish map?
I'm promoting her work as being extraordinarily carefully done. She built, I get a kick out of people who say she built a model. She built more than 20 models.
Yeah.
She also, indeed, as you pointed out, used the best data available at the time. And now we have, thank goodness for that kind of work, the Hipparcos satellite, which made literally millions of measurements of the positions of the stars. Listeners should be made aware that the difficult part about what she did was to get good distance data for the stars. Any astronomer can look at any star. He needs two angles, and it doesn't matter whether the star is 20 light years away or 40 light years away. It's in the crosshairs, so to speak. But if you're going to try to see if there's a match between a two-dimensional drawing, which is all we had to begin with, all she had to begin with, and the real world, you got to have 3 dimensions.
Yeah.
And that was the hard part. And
but you're not answering
a great
the
deal
question.
of time. I'm answering the question in the sense that there is no question that there is not a perfect match. It would be extraordinary if there were. The base stars, however, there is considerable dispute with something you just said about the kind of stars they are and so forth. Zeta 1 and Zeta 2 Reticuli seem to be still very special. And Marjorie was perfectly willing. She's one of the most objective people I've ever met, and I did meet her several times. I was the first, indeed, as you gave me credit for, to publish an article about her work in the early 70s in that great scientific journal, Bob, Saga Magazine.
Yeah, with B. Ann Slate.
Yes, Bobby Ann Slate Rhonda. as a matter of fact, who is no longer with us, unfortunately. And Marjorie just died in April, for those who wonder about such things.
Yes. But you didn't answer so you said she did a wonderful model, and it was really good. She took the data that she had, that everybody had, and it made a really nice model from it, and that's very good. I know other people who have made models.
More than 20 models. More than 20.
Well, I don't know anybody who made 20 models, but okay, so she made a nice model, and the stars are very special. They sound like a child with in special education classes. I mean, you're very special. Okay, what does that mean? That these stars are special? Doesn't mean a thing. It means let's face it. The fish map is dead, and I mean I know how difficult it must be to go in front of an audience and say, well, this thing I've been telling you about for the last 45 years. Well, excuse me, I was flat out wrong. I mean, I realize that's not easy to say, but I mean, let's face it. If you say you're a scientist, you have to admit you're wrong when new data comes in and shows that what you were saying before simply isn't correct.
I still have reason to believe from her work and other people's support, and I've talked to other astronomers, and Astronomy Magazine editor Terrence Dickinson, I talked to him recently. Do you think Marjorie was on the right track? Words like that, and we agreed. And
on the right track of what?
If you look at my movie, UFOs are real, and I wish it were flying saucers are real, but it's UFOs are real. What can I say? In there, we interviewed Dr. Mitchell, who was head of the astronomy department at Ohio State University. And he was very helpful to Marjorie because, as strange as it might sound, she was not allowed access to some of the star catalogs. That was privileged information. So he interceded and helped her get data.
Yeah, I think they were just worried about losing their copies and stuff like that in the libraries in those days.
Well,
nothing was online.
What I'm saying is he stated publicly in the movie, it's on my website, you can get it, I'm not hiding it from anybody, that her work was accurate and well done. He had his students check it out, as a matter of fact.
No, I agree with you. And her work, she took the data in the Gliese 2 catalog, and she mapped it out correctly and built the models correctly. However, it still doesn't mean a thing, because we now know that whatever resemblance it once looked like there might have been, and even that was pretty tenuous, we now know that was based on a lot of errors, and that those stars are simply gone. And well, okay, I mean, if we're going to gone from the criteria that we were being told had to be followed.
I have to agree with you on one count. There was an early report that your buddy from QFOS, you talked about him earlier.
Oh, Alan Hendry, yeah.
Alan Hendry, yes. He wrote an article in that great scientific journal, Fate magazine, in which he basically threw out her work because one of the Zeta Reticuli, or Zeta 2 Reticuli, was supposedly a binary star itself, a double star itself.
Right.
And unfortunately, he didn't check this was from a footnote in a publication in a scientific journal.
Yes.
Unpublished, it said after it. So, of course, I checked with, and colleagues of mine and I checked with the people who wrote those original articles. And they very definitely said that they were wrong. And I love the title they give to what the effect was, that the supposed, should I use the word duplicity? No, anyway.
Well, yeah.
I don't know whether it
I guess you could use it, but doubleness or something. But this is pointless. Again, this is a red herring. This has nothing to do with the question of the authenticity of the map.
That was the original fuss. That was the original
that was 30 years ago, and actually I contacted that same researcher. It was a French researcher, as I recall.
Bono,
and who was originally submitted it, and he said no. That was they didn't say it absolutely positively was double. They said they think it might be double, and he now said.
But when they went back, they called it Mickey's ears. Mickey Mouse, of course.
Yeah. But the point is, this has nothing to do with what I'm saying. The Hipparcos data completely throws out the fish map. You have to have these stars of a certain type in a certain position and they have to not be double, and they have to not be variable, and so on. And all that is out the window now with the new data, and all you have is a star map that's really special. Well, let's give it a little award or something. It's make it feel good. But
how accurate?
To say that something is special doesn't mean a damn thing. Lots of stars are special. Okay, my favorite stars, and these are in Elcor because I look at them in the star parties when I do the star parties out in the park. And those stars are special too, but that has nothing to do with UFOs or Betty Hill or anything else. And so you're just dancing around. You don't want to admit that you've been wrong about this.
There were mistakes due to the fact that the data wasn't any better than it was. There's no question. There's no question that the positional data, coupled with the fact that we're talking about a drawing done under hypnosis, what's the word? Power of suggestion, whatever you want.
Post-hypnotic suggestion, yes.
Yes, if and only if she could remember it accurately. Now,
right.
How accurate are you going to draw something that's 3 feet by 2 feet by 3 feet? And how accurate is that? Within an inch, a tenth of an inch?
Yeah,
who knows?
So the whole enterprise,
nobody knows.
It was a delusion. It was an exercise in fooling yourself.
I think you'll find that the objections raised by Carl Sagan and what's the other guy? Stephen Soder, right?
Yeah.
That was the other guy. That they made a bunch of wrong assumptions themselves. Look, are we dealing with a perfect scientific investigation? Of course not. We didn't have the data then. We have most of the data now, but there are still arguments about some aspects of that. So, that's not the only thing. I mean, Bob, let's face it. You explained away the Hill case, first saying it was Jupiter, which they described as going in front of the moon, which is a very neat trick for Jupiter.
That didn't come until later, though. That was not part of the original report. It was only later, I think it was after the hypnosis, that they described that Betty said that the object went in front of the moon. And so, once
they also described it going near the old man of the mountain, which doesn't exist anymore, unfortunately, and I cannot restore it.
Yeah.
It was 1.5 times the size of the old man of the mountain. That's 48 feet, so that would be 72 feet. That ain't Jupiter, man.
Size estimates mean nothing unless you know for certain the distance of an object and the angle it subtends. You cannot accurately tell the size of anything.
If it was 1.5 times the size of the old man of the mountain, for people listening, that was a rock formation. It appears even on some official documents of the state of New Hampshire, or a big tourist attraction, and it fell into the lake.
Fell down. Yeah.
Didn't last too long, but what are you going to do? But that wasn't Jupiter, and you've left out, of course, that Barney remembered seeing the beings on board through the windows, and in the new book, Captured, by Kathleen Marden, Betty's niece, and myself, she did 85% of the work, so let's give her credit. She did a cross-comparison between the testimony of each of them under hypnosis compared with each other. The hypnosis sessions were all separate, of course. They were not together. And you couldn't hear the other one. And they were told strongly to forget what went on in the session, et cetera. Anyway, when you do that cross-comparison, when they were each describing what happened to them, their descriptions match. Hardly seems likely if this was a random non-event, so to speak. Random non-event.
Well,
anyway,
except that they lived together, and most of the time, 99.99% of the time, they were not hypnotized, and they were free to talk about this as much as they want. Lots of people.
But they weren't talking about it. And Betty had dreams. They don't match. Read the book, Bob.
I have, and I have the book.
I noticed you didn't bring it up. I appreciate your buying the book. Thank you very much.
Actually, it was a review copy. I didn't have to pay for it.
Oh, darn. I hope you told other people to buy it, because you would
they'll make up their own decision based on that. So I mean, but even Betty, I mean, but even Kathleen Martin is admitting that a lot of this stuff is
who?
It's
Kathleen Martin?
Yeah, she's admitting that a lot of this doesn't make sense. She said this portion of Betty's interview does not stand up under scrutiny. It is clearly characteristic of the rich fantasy material found in dreams. Perhaps her subconscious mind's attempt to add acceptable elements to an otherwise traumatic event. It's page 133.
That's why she did so much work to check, to interview Betty, to find out what she really thought, and to, transcribe all the tapes. I'm a lousy typist. I sure wouldn't want that job.
Of the hypnosis things, of course, she has those tapes. I don't think anybody else has them. The Betty's papers, as you know, are in the special collection at the University of New Hampshire in
yes.
What is it, Durham, and a lot of people are
research. They're research material and accessible by appropriately qualified. Is that the word?
Pretty much anybody, I think, is qualified to go in there. I don't think you have to have any demonstration of
the tapes. The tapes are.
But the tapes are not available somehow, and I don't know why. Maybe because I'm not sure. Maybe Martin still has them or what, but they should be.
Well, they're considered part of the medical picture, after all. It's a whole tricky business.
But if the medical is not available, I mean, they want to use these tapes as evidence for what they want to prove. But then if you say, okay, let me see the whole tape, no, they're privileged. You can't see them. So I mean, what gives here? We're only allowed to see what somebody sort of reveals to us.
No, it's much more complicated than that. And if anybody is listening, go to my website, go to Kathleen's website, and ask her about access and stuff like that. I'm glad that the stuff was preserved, because rarely does that happen, as you know. In many cases, this data is gone, finished. That's the end of it. I think that case is an excellent case, the Hill case. Partly, the biggest thing I would say, not only the character of Betty and Barney, which is a separate sort of question here, but the skill of Dr. Benjamin Simon. Now, here was the world's expert, if you will, on PTSD, we call it now. Then it was
shell shock.
Yeah, he ran a hospital with 3,000 beds for World War II sufferers, victims. I don't know what is the right word to use. But he didn't know anything about flying saucers. Nobody said he did. And frankly, when I was going through the first book, I was thinking, why didn't he ask this? Why didn't he ask that? He wasn't interested in the flying saucer part. He was trying to help two people who'd obviously had a problem, of PTSD, we'd say now.
Now, Betty used to go to this UFO landing spot, she called it, several times a week. It was down as a railroad crossing, I think near Exeter or something. And she would see UFOs frequently when she was down there. And it's kind of interesting because the famous comment of John Oswald, who was, I think, with QFOS, he went there with her one night, and he said, on the night I was there, Betty was unable to distinguish between a landed UFO and a streetlight. Then
Kathleen made quite clear that was a problem, not Betty's enthusiasm.
Yeah. And John Fuller, it turns out, warned her about this and said, Betty, you're destroying your credibility with these kinds of things. And so you don't think that this reflects negatively? It doesn't show that she was a fantasy-prone sort of a person?
She was a social worker for the state of New Hampshire.
Well, but that's not exclusive.
One of the section, no, but her boss was careful to have people in her department who weren't fantasy prone. Let's hope, for goodness sakes.
Well, fantasy for UFO is not. I mean, if somebody's fantasy prone, maybe that means they believe in ghosts or UFOs or something. It doesn't mean they necessarily believe every story they hear or they're fantasy prone in their work. I mean, people compartmentalize these things.
Well, sure, you rule out what you want to rule out and take in what you want to take in. I think people need to make their own decisions about the story. It is interesting that Barney was on the Governor's Civil Rights Commission, that they were extremely well thought of in the community, and something that a lot of people don't seem to know, I'm sure you do, is that they were not out seeking publicity. This story got out in spite of their efforts. A guy violated their confidence, called them, wanted to do an interview. They said absolutely not. He ran the story in a Boston newspaper.
Well, they went and spoke to the church and told their story, and I guess that's how the reporter found out about it. And
somebody taped it and gave him the tape.
But they were already speaking in public about this, so it's not quite as bad.
Very closed group. They were certainly not looking for story. They both thought they'd lose their jobs, frankly. And fortunately, the story turned out not to cause that to happen. It went over quite well, so to speak. And so they managed to live through that. And there is a real problem, and you hit upon it. Betty was being besieged by people, and she was trying to justify. And remember, Barney died early on in this whole thing, 69.
69, yeah. So 8 years or so, 7.5, 8 years after the incident.
Yeah, but only a couple years, 3 years after the book came out. So she had to go through all this on her own, pretty much. It's a fascinating story. It's not the only abduction story, but certainly it's the first one that got a lot of attention. Not the first abduction, which is a different question, but the first one that got a lot of attention.
It wasn't. There was Via Boas down in.
Yes, but it didn't get any attention
other than APRO and a few places. It wasn't.
Yeah, that's why I said it wasn't. It wasn't the first abduction. But I think it was the
second one. I don't think there was anything else in the U.S. There was no abduction claims in the U.S. before this.
Well, I think what we find is that there were plenty afterward, talking about earlier experiences, which is, quite another
Well, these Me Too things are always to be suspect. Whenever there's a major case, you'll always get a number of Me Too witnesses coming out afterwards.
Copycat.
And then you do, but the question is, did they really see this, or are they just jumping on a bandwagon?
Well, I think they really saw it. I'm satisfied, having listened to portions of the tapes and having talked to both of them. I did meet Barney as well as Betty, of course. Even though he died a few months after I met him. It's an important case. I think Kathleen did a splendid job in going over this stuff. And as a matter of fact, she has a new book out about 2 abductions. Well, more than 2, but
mostly those 2. Yeah, actually, I have that book too, and I'm going to get on to writing a review on that one. Well, I didn't have to pay for that one either. That was a review copy, but people can buy their own copies if they want, if they like the book. Yeah, they can. And incidentally, another book for people who haven't heard about it, we haven't mentioned it so far, is Dr. Don Dondery's book about abductions and aliens and UFOs. He was a professor of psychology at McGill University in Montreal, UFOs, ETs, and alien abductions. And I got to give Don credit for something. He was willing to introduce me. He did introduce me when I spoke at McGill. Full professor. He's my age, I guess. We were both at the University of Chicago about the same time. And not too many professors at that time when I spoke there many years ago would have been willing to talk to a hall full of people and introduce a physicist talking about flying saucers are real. So I admire the man's courage, and recommend the book too, incidentally. I say that because, there are plenty of books out there, and some of them are crap. And I think you and I would probably agree on that. Yeah. I haven't seen this one yet. I did read a little bit about it, but that'd be something else to put on the reading file there. It's what? This year. It's this year. And like I say, if you want somebody who's respectable, a full professor of psychology at McGill University. Well, again, credentials don't mean much in a thing like this, but...
We are coming to our final break. We'll be right back. Everyone stay tuned to Third Phase of Moon Radio. We are back to Third Phase of Moon Radio Live. I'm your host, Dr. J. Andy Elias, and I'm here with Blake Cousins. We have a very special debate on are UFOs visiting Earth, and are they inhabited by extraterrestrials? On one corner, we have the flying saucer physicist, Stanton Friedman, who can be seen at www.stantonfriedman.com. On the other side, we have famed skeptic and debunker Robert Schaefer. His two sites are badufos.com and debunker.com. Before we go back to that debate, I just want to tell everyone the winner of this week's Contact in the Desert ticket. The winner, if you're listening, is Patrick Surel Katim. Once again, the winner for this week's Contact in the Desert ticket is Patrick Surel Katim. You can find all the information on contactinthedesert.net. And this last leg of the show, we want to open up the lines for all you listeners out there to chime in or ask any of the guests any questions. The phone number is 818-923-1713. Again, 818-923-1713. I also want to give both of you gentlemen your opportunity to give closing statements, whether or not the listeners call in. And I believe Blake Cousins had a question. Blake, do you still have one?
Certainly do, John, and congratulations to the winner. I wanted to bring up H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, Aliens Invading Earth. At the end of the movie, they didn't quite make it because man had the common cold. Disease killed the aliens. Now, my question to both Robert and Stanton Friedman is, I'm sure both of you guys are going to have different answers, because I think if there was an alien body right here on Earth, it would be a national security issue, just due to the fact of disease getting around, infecting possibly the human race. Do you think, Robert, that aliens, if there was a body, that it's a national security issue?
Oh, absolutely it would be, because like you said, we know nothing about that thing biologically. We would have to consider it to be a biohazard. And even to go a little further down that same line of reasoning, we've heard a lot of speculation, especially in the early part of the space age, and how we were going to go to planets and take our, oxygen supply and take some food, and then when we get there, we're going to grow food, or we're going to do this and do that. And I'm saying maybe we didn't realize it, and certainly I didn't realize it then, but I realize now, and I think a lot of people do, that we are part of a biosphere here. We are a product of many millions of years of evolution. Our entire body is a biosphere. We have all these creatures that live on us, and we feed them, and they help us break down things in our gut and our skin and everything. And just the whole notion that you're going to go to a completely alien biosphere with alien organisms that evolved under completely different situations, and the notion that you're going to just stroll around, or that you're going to plant your food and grow it there, I mean, you just have no idea what's going to happen with those things. And it's such a complicated interconnected biosphere that I'm saying I can't see how humans could ever live anywhere else. Even if we set aside the problem of how would we get there, even if we could get there, I don't think we could survive there in the sense. Maybe we can make little bunkers and seal ourselves off, hermetically and so on. But the notion that we could live on an alien planet, I just don't think makes any sense.
Well, I'm saying that they can live here. I'm not saying we can live there. Anybody advanced enough to get here. I mean, we have had fancy technology for less than 125 years. First long-distance radio was 1901. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
That's a very short percentage of the time that we've been around. Nuclear stuff, all kinds of advanced technology. Progress comes from doing things differently in an unpredictable way. There's no question aliens don't get here using dumb old chemical rockets. On the other hand, I worked on studies of nuclear fusion rockets, the major source of energy in the universe. All the stars work by nuclear fusion. I worked on those in the early 60s. So if these guys are, 1,000 years ahead of us, they know a heck of a lot about biology as well as technology. And, of course, that does raise the question, and I get asked this one all the time. Isaac Asimov said, if they were coming here, they'd either make themselves known or they stayed hidden. If they do neither, they can't be coming here. Like Isaac had interviewed a lot of aliens to find out what their reasons are. One thing about us that would be of interest to everybody in the neighborhood, let's say within 50 light years, what the heck? Zeta Reticuli is only 39 light years. But one thing about us that would be of concern to all of them is that we have learned the secret of nuclear fusion. And the whole notion, and I just did an article for the MUFON Journal about the atom and the saucer. People forget how much energy we've taken control of just within my lifetime. Yours almost too, Bob. You're 15 years older than I am, but still.
Younger.
I'm sorry.
Backwards, right? Yeah.
Wishful thinking, Bob. Wishful thinking. Anyway, a big bomb during World War II was a 10-ton blockbuster, 10 tons of dynamite. By 1945, first A-bomb, we're talking roughly 15,000 tons of dynamite energy release. By 1952, a mere 7 years later, it was 10 million tons of TNT. And the Russians sent off a boomer that was 50 million tons of TNT. Used properly, that would take us to the stars. And if you were an alien, and we'd probably agree on this, you wouldn't want us out there. We're a primitive society whose major activity is tribal warfare. So they'd want to check us out to make sure, and a guy named Robert Hastings has done some exciting work about nukes and UFOs, the missiles that go offline when they shouldn't go offline with nuclear tips on them.
Yeah, he's the guy who claims that the skeptics are funded by the CIA.
Well, I don't know who funds the skeptics. I hope you have a good income, Bob.
Not from skepticism, that's for sure.
Not from believing either, buddy.
Yeah. You mentioned nuclear fusion, and you've been mentioning this over the years.
Yes.
I want to refer people back to some papers that were written, and especially this one by Edward M. Purcell, who won the Nobel Prize in Physics. He was a guy who discovered the 21-centimeter radiation, and he had also invented nuclear magnetic resonance. So every time you get an MRI scan, that's Edward Purcell's invention that you are using there. If you go to my Bad UFOs and plug in the word preposterous, it will in the search box, it will come up with this piece I wrote a few months back, is Interstellar Travel Preposterous. And going into, in some detail, Edward Purcell's paper on this, he says that if you want, he's not talking about a level of technology. He's assuming that your technology is 100% efficient and there's no waste and all of the energy goes where you want it to go. He says if you want to use ideal nuclear fusion, burn hydrogen to helium with 100% efficiency. By means unspecified, I shall throw the helium out the back with kinetic energy equivalent to the entire mass change. You can't beat that with fusion. One can easily work out the exhaust velocity and so on. The equation in Figure 13 tells us to attain a speed of 99% speed of light, we need an initial mass which is a little over 1 billion times the final mass. In other words,
I talk about his work, and I should point out he had a very high level of security clearance, worked on committees.
Good for it. So you're saying that
he didn't know what he was talking about.
He was a nuclear physicist. Nobel Prize in Physics, and he didn't know what he was talking about in nuclear fusion.
We're talking about technology here. He made all the wrong.
No, we're not talking about technology. He said,
yes, we are.
The technology. He said, even if you had 100% flawless technology, which could do this magically without any energy being lost, you would need 1.6 times 10 to the 9th times the final mass in order to accelerate you over.
Sorry about that, Bob, but it's just like Dr. Campbell proved that if you want to send a man to the moon, this is in 1941, the initial launch weight, and he had pages of equations. He wrote a scientific paper. I talk about this in my book, Flying Saucers and Science. I also talk about Dr. Purcell. Campbell showed that the required initial launch weight would be 1 million tons. If you make enough stupid assumptions, you can prove anything is impossible. Good engineers.
But he wasn't making any assumption.
Of course he was. He assumed you accelerated for 5 light years. Why would you do that? You get close to the speed of light.
Somehow.
Well, at the end of a year, you're at close to the speed of light. Why would you keep spending your energy accelerating? A 747 doesn't keep going full tilt once it gets.
Well, that's if you want to go to 0.99 the speed of light. Now you could go to 0.9 or something, and then it wouldn't be 1 billion times. It might only be 100 million times. Yeah, and of course you're going to need an equivalent amount to decelerate, and that's a separate problem. But in fact, that's payload when you start out. So we're not talking 10 to the 9th, we're talking 10 to the 18th.
He made the wrong assumptions about how you go about the trip, and this is standard practice. I'm not saying it was because he was evil or that he was stupid. He made the wrong assumptions that make the picture look very bleak. Almost everything in my book, Science Was Wrong, has loads of examples of great scientists making wrong assumptions and coming up with obviously wrong, in retrospect, conclusions. Man will never fly. You know, there's a whole bunch of these. And
the only way you could get around this at all is by going not as fast as 0.99. Like you said, well, why accelerate for 5 years? Why not just accelerate for 1 year? Again, it'll be less depending if you want to, if you're satisfied with lower speeds. But the point is, you need gargantuan amounts of hydrogen to fuse into helium with perfect efficiency to put.
You're forgetting we use cosmic freeloading. My expression, and if you don't like it, call it something else. A gravitational assist. How's that? That sounds.
Well, that's got nothing to do with it. You can't. Are you going to use a gravitational?
It has everything to do with it.
How much energy gravitational? That's only in our solar system. That only works when you get up close to planets and stuff like that. How are you going to use a gravitational assist to get to Alpha Centauri? Tell me that.
When you go past the sun.
Oh, so you're going to go past the sun and use gravitational.
Well, you better.
You're going to use, well, it could go the other way, away from the sun, but I just
not a good idea. But what I'm saying here is I talk about this question, and it's a common problem that people make strange assumptions. There are some very good studies, and I reference them in Flying Saucers in Science. John Luce and John Hilton. Luce was head of the fusion work at Oak Ridge. Then he became manager of research at Aerojet General Nucleonics, where I worked, and we did a study for the Air Force on fusion propulsion for deep space travel. That was a small study. We only spent $9 million. And that's not a big study as such things go. But everything depends on the assumptions you make to begin with. Dr. Campbell amply demonstrated that. So it's not a simple question. Let's see, I'll sit down, jot down some numbers here. Oh, I can show it's impossible, or I can show it's possible.
Yeah, but he showed the optimal case. He didn't even worry about the technology. How would you control the fusion? No, but that's granting every possible assumption that could be made of perfect technology, no energy loss.
I looked at his paper, and I talk about his paper, and if you don't have my book, go out and buy it, Bob. Flying Saucers in Science.
More I got to debunk then, huh?
Yeah, it'll keep you. Look, debunkers have a lifetime of activity in front of them. That's a good position to be in. There's always something to debunk.
Well, L. Sprague de Camp, the science fiction writer who is also one of the founding members of Psychops, said that the skeptics are like the garbage men of science. Said it's not a glamorous job, but imagine how bad everything would smell if nobody took out the garbage.
Well, that's very true. And imagine, you look at a skeptic like Dr. Michael Shermer, who starts off in a debate that we did, which I won 80% to 20%, saying that the only reason some sightings can't be explained is that in all strange phenomena there's a 5% residue. That Blue Book Special Report 14, it was 21.5% that couldn't be explained. And in the Condon Report, it was 30% that couldn't be explained. And no wonder I won the debate. He hadn't done his homework.
Mendel and Taves went back on those Condon unknowns, and they, of course, suggested their own explanation for each one of those, which probably you wouldn't accept, and I'm not sure I'd accept all of them. I'd probably accept some of them.
We'd probably agree on some of those, and others. I mean, look, the New York Times, in its infinite wisdom, said that Goddard basically was full of baloney in 1919 when he mentioned in a paper dealing with something else that rockets might work out in space. And they said he didn't even know the basics that people in high school know, that you got to have something to react against. Rockets don't work in a vacuum. Well, they corrected that as we were on the way to the moon, believe it or not. They admitted they were in error. And don't ask me how they got into it in the first place. But look, you get all kinds of strange things going on. I get people telling me a saucer coming from another solar system, just down the street, 40 light years away, couldn't crash after all. At Roswell, he was thinking about. And I had to point out that it's not the mothership that crashes, it's the little Earth excursion modules, and we have a direct analog for that. We have huge aircraft carriers that can operate for 18 years without refueling, which is one humongous amount of effort going in.
Of course, the crew would have starved by then if they weren't resupplied. But
I didn't say the crew wasn't.
Still be going. Yeah.
Yeah, but the airplanes, the little airplanes on board, the big carriers carry about 7
right,
tons.
Exactly. And
they
even
could go 2 hours
Sagan
without refueling.
Yeah.
So
even Carl Sagan made that same argument, and I pointed out that that's not correct. That he said, well, we have so many sightings. If extraterrestrials were to come, they would come here once. But we have a lot of sightings, and therefore they're not all coming here all at once. I said, well, that doesn't follow, because they could be citing the same thing over again, or like you said, there could be the Earth excursion modules. So, I mean, if you're going to make arguments, try to make ones that are logically sound, whether you're a skeptic or not. Try to be, logically
We agree,
sound.
Bob. Hey, we agree.
Well, on a few things, but there's a much longer list of things that we don't agree. I'm still convinced there's not any credible evidence that extraterrestrials have ever visited the Earth.
Well, listen, gentlemen, we're coming down to the last 8 minutes, and I want to continue this debate, but I want both of you to have an opportunity to give a closing argument. Mr. Friedman, since you started, why don't you go ahead and give yours, and then Mr. Schaefer, and then we can continue until the show's over.
Okay, as usual, we find that arguments between, I hate the word, but believers and non-believers are difficult to sort out in the time of a radio program, and I don't care how long the program is. And the audience has no way to check on what either one says, so whoever shouts the loudest maybe, or sounds the smoothest, or whatever. I'm convinced, as I describe in my books, that the evidence is overwhelming that the planet's being visited, that we're dealing with a government cover-up. My favorite document, incidentally, is a CIA top-secret Umbra document that says, deny in toto at the top, and it's all whited out. There's not one word on the page that they could declassify, and yet people say there isn't any cover-up. There are plenty of other documents in which they're very generous. You can read 5 or 6 words. I mean, my goodness, that's no cover-up, is it? You're darn right it's a cover-up. So the evidence is there. We're not going to resolve it tonight. And it's clear the government is not about to give us what's on its plate or what's on its table, however you want to call it. And people say, well, Stan, why would they want to keep it secret? And I give 6 reasons for that. For all governments, this isn't an American problem. It's a planetary problem. And that's the problem. Most of the countries on the planet don't want to be planetary. They want to be nationalistic. 6 reasons. You want to figure out how the darn things work. They make wonderful weapons delivery and defense systems. You got wreckage. Rule number 1 for security is you can't tell your friends without telling your enemies, because they listen to the radio, read newspapers, etc. The second problem is the other side of the same coin. What if the other guy figures out how they work before you do? How do you defend against them? You don't want him to know you know he knows. We've been playing that game for a long time. The third problem is, what if an announcement were to be made tomorrow? Wouldn't this make a great program? By highly trusted individuals around the world, the Queen and the Pope, there's an odd couple, but what the heck, saying that indeed some UFOs are alien spacecraft. What would happen? I think church attendance would go up, mental hospital admission would go up, the stock market would go down. But I think one of the things that would happen, based on my more than 700 college lectures, is that the younger generation, which, unlike me, wasn't around when there wasn't a space program, would push for a new view of ourselves. Instead of as Americans, Canadians on both, Greeks, Peruvians, Chileans, whatever, they would say, why don't we think of ourselves as Earthlings? We are all Earthlings. There's no government on this planet that wants its citizens to owe their primary allegiance to the planet. Nationalism is the only game in town. There's a fourth problem. Pat Robertson has loudly proclaimed that all the intelligent life in the universe is on planet Earth. Sometimes I'm wondering if there's any intelligent life on planet Earth. He also thinks the world was created in 4004 BC. I think it was a Thursday afternoon, and I don't buy that one either. Fifth problem is people said to me, well, look, Stan, come on. If aliens were coming here, that means they have more technology than we do. That means soon there'll be a new method of energy production. There goes the oil industry, new method of ground and air transport. There goes those industries. New methods of computers and communications. Economic chaos. And my only answer is, I think we learned to do without big buggy whip manufacturers. Now, the last reason, because of all the lecturing, I have on 7 different occasions been quietly told by members of the audience that, and not for public consumption, that they were aware of cases in which military planes had gone up to chase UFOs and never came back. If you look at the book, Frank Ficino's book, Shoot Them Down, it turns out there were over 200 fatal military plane crashes in the early 50s, with the New York Times using words like disintegrated, disappeared, strange words. Now, if I've heard 7 such stories, there got to be a lot more out there, because I'm not everywhere all the time, et cetera. I can see where the government wouldn't want to tell anybody. And people who say, well, they would have told the family, Stan. Well, there's a book, By Any Means Necessary, by William Burroughs, Burrows, in which he talks about 166 military crewmen on board planes that were tickling the radar, his expression, not mine, North Korea, China, and Russia. They dash in, see how quickly the radar would come on, what frequency they were using, et cetera. This is mostly right after World War II. A lot of those planes got shot down.
Mr. Friedman, we're coming down to the last couple minutes.
Okay.
I want to give Mr. Schaefer
yes.
a moment.
Yes, I adjourn.
Right. Well, Stan, this business about 7 members of the audience. I'm sure that you understand as well as I do that there are just some people who like to tell tales and people who like to, say something that will make them feel important and seem to be important, but there's absolutely no proof of anything that they're saying. And I would think that anybody who would take seriously anything that's told kind of in this anonymous and proofless way should realize that there's a very little probability, if any, that there's any substance to that. You were talking about UFOs being a planetary problem, and I agree, although it's a different context, because it's a planetary problem that if there is a cover-up in the U.S., well, surely the U.S. is not the only country because,
right.
Okay, so we know that that has these secrets. So we know that in the U.K., for example, it was a U.S. base. Okay, some people believe in this Rendlesham so-called UFO landing there.
Yeah.
So now the U.K. government must know about it. But, you would have to not only maintain a cover-up in the United States and in the U.K., but in literally every country in the world that was big enough to have airplanes or to have, anything. I mean, if the government of Spain would decide, or the government of Greece, or the government of South Korea would decide to release their UFO secrets, you have to believe that this so-called cover-up is worldwide, because saucers are going to crash randomly. You're not going to just crash in the desert. You're not going to just crash in the New Mexico Triangle where, space vehicles mysteriously disappear into the sand. So you have to believe that not only are we covering them up, but every single government has agreed to do this, And you have to believe that none of them see an incentive to themselves to break that agreement. In other words, often when there's a conspiracy in the sense of, people conspiring to do something for their own personal gain, somebody says, gee, if I cheat, then I can, get ahead. And it's absolutely not believable. Even if you say there's one, then you got to believe there's 110 or something like that. And this whole disclosure thing, everybody is so convinced that, disclosure is just around the corner. The government's going to tell us everything it knows. I want to close with Glass's UFO curse. And I forget exactly where he wrote this.
To give each of you a minute, real quick, to tell the listeners where they can find your information, your website, and anything else like that. Go ahead, Mr. Friedman.
I'm easy to reach. My website is www.stantonfriedman, FRIEDMAN.com. My email address is FS as in flying saucer, PHYS as in physicist, at Rogers, ROGERS.com. There are all kinds of other stuff on the internet, of course, but I won't take responsibility for all of that.
And Mr. Schaefer, how about you? Tell the listeners and the viewers how they could find you.
Well, I have a blog called badufos.com. I try to stay up to date on all the weird stuff that's happening and strange claims and whatever else. I also have the debunker.com as a website, which mostly is archives of the older material. The newer material is on bad UFOs. I write for the Skeptical Inquirer, a column called Psychic Vibrations, which is now available as a book. You can find it on Amazon. I also have a book called UFO Sightings, which is published by Prometheus Books.
And now, we welcome you back to Third Phase of Moon Radio. I'm your host, Dr. J, with Blake Cousins, and for the 100,000 subscribers to Third Phase of Moon, we have an amazing show for you today. We have a debate going back a question from decades, if not millennia. Are we alone in the universe? But more importantly, now that the Kepler telescope is finding so many planets, the question is, are these UFOs people are seeing inhabited by extraterrestrials? That's the question. To debate this, we have the flying saucer physicist, Mr. Stanton Friedman. Mr. Friedman, you there?
I'm here in beautiful Fredericton, New Brunswick, Canada, where it's raining.
And we also have famed skeptic and debunker, Mr. Robert Schaefer. Mr. Schaefer, how are you?
I'm doing just fine. I'm near San Diego, and it's sunny and warm.
Joining me in this moderation is the founder of Third Phase Moon, Blake Cousins. Blake, how are you today?
We're doing good right here in the sunny state of Hawaii. Sorry, guys, but it's nice and blue, and we're looking forward to this great debate. Are we alone in the universe? Can't wait to get started.
So this is what we're going to do. Mr. Friedman, we're going to go with opening statements with you first. Then, Mr. Schaefer, we're going to have you respond with your own opening statement. And then we'll talk about general topics and just go back and forth. Go ahead, Mr. Friedman.
Okay, after, since 1958, that's 55 years, I've reached four major conclusions about flying saucers. And I much prefer the term because all flying saucer UFOs, but not all UFOs are flying saucers. Just like all great-grandfathers are men, but not all men are great-grandfathers. I happen to be one, as a matter of fact. But I don't get extra points for that, I don't think. Four major conclusions. One, the evidence is overwhelming that Earth is being visited by intelligently controlled extraterrestrial spacecraft. In other words, some, underlined 37 times, some UFOs are alien spacecraft. Most are not. Just like most isotopes aren't fissionable. If I want to build a reactor, I use the ones that aren't. Secondly, we're dealing with what I call a cosmic Watergate. That is to say, some few people within major governments have known since at least 1947 that indeed some UFOs are alien spacecraft. Now, notice I didn't say everybody in government knows. That's not how you keep secrets. I spent 14 years in industry working on classified programs. There's the need to know, an appropriate clearance. It isn't easy to find out what's going on. The third conclusion is there are no good arguments against the first two conclusions. And the fourth is we're dealing with the biggest story of the millennium. Visits to planet Earth by alien spacecraft, successful cover-up of the best data, bodies, and wreckage for, 66 years, I guess, now. And also I've concluded that there are four basic rules used by debunkers, not just about UFOs, but about any subject they want to debunk. And there's plenty of debunking going on in the world. I even join in on some of it. First, don't bother me with the facts, my mind's made up. Second, what the public doesn't know, I'm not going to tell them. Third, do your research by proclamation. Investigation is too much trouble. And fourth, I have forgotten, so we'll leave that one out.
Mr. Schaefer, you just made 5 things right there. Is there anything you'd like to respond to all those on top of your...
Well, I don't want to do a point-by-point thing here. First, I just want to say I was surprised to learn that the topic of this debate is supposed to be, are we alone in the universe? I don't believe we are alone in the universe. I've never said that we are alone in the universe. And in fact, I consider that idea to be the prime UFO fallacy. Whenever I say to a group of people that, I don't believe that these UFO reports that are coming in, that there anything extraterrestrial about them, or that there are any extraterrestrials here, then very often they will say in a very forceful and kind of confrontational way, well, what makes you so sure we're the only people in the universe? I said, I never said that. I'm not claiming that at all. This universe is an enormously vast place. And, if you just think of how far, if you were a light beam and you were traveling out and you travel for years and years at the speed of light, you're only at the nearby stars, that you haven't even gotten anywhere. You travel 50,000 years. Think of how much, what happened. Think of what was going on 50,000 years ago. That light beam's traveling 50,000 years. Still hasn't even left our galaxy. And there's so many galaxies. So I would never say there's nobody out there. But what I would say is that there's no credible evidence of any visitations of extraterrestrials here to the Earth. Now, to touch on one of the points that Stanton brought up about, the cosmic Watergate and so on, and they're keeping these secrets from us, one of the examples that Stanton has been using in his lectures, people say government can't keep a secret. Stanton is arguing that they can, and his example is the Corona project, which was the very first spy satellite project, and it began in, I think, the late 50s and early 60s, in the very early days of the space age, and it wasn't declassified until 1995, and so Stanton has given this as an example of government being able to keep a secret. Stanton, it's too bad you didn't read a book by your old buddy Philip J. Klass, Secret Sentries in Space. He has chapter 10. It's about the Discoverer satellites. He doesn't just talk about the program being there. He talks about how he tells each launch which ones were successful, which ones made it into orbit, which ones successfully deployed their cameras, their film. It's he's got so much detail there. This was published in 1971. And so, if you want to choose an example of supposedly how the government can keep a secret, that is a very bad example, because you simply wrong.
Did you say Discoverer?
Yes.
Did I hear you right?
Yes.
Okay.
If you go into Wikipedia, and you type in Discoverer, it forwards to Corona. That the one thing they did keep secret apparently was the name of the project. But if every one of these satellites of that project is discussed here, and this is why Philip Klass, the late Phil Klass, who of course was a very high-profile UFO skeptic, died about 5-6 years back. he was adamant that there was no cover-up or anything in Washington in the government, because if there were, he said he has so many of the contacts and people leaking things to him. I mean, that's Aviation Week. That's like the original WikiLeaks. And so he was quite certain that there was no cover-up, because he found out about everything else. He found out about this Corona project, and he found out about the Stealth project and everything while it was still secret. But nothing has ever leaked out about UFOs.
Well, that shows how negligent he was in his research. It's very simple and straightforward. The kicker here is most Americans, well, most people in the world, I guess it's a small world anymore, have no idea how big the black budgets have been over the years for the NRO and the NSA and the OSI. And, I get a kick out of, now let Phil rest in peace for a moment. There are other things to be said about him. And I will call him an honest man in the sense that he paid his debt. He challenged me about one of the MJ-12 documents, and when I proved him wrong, he paid his debt. So I'll give him credit for that. I could use the $1,000, but secrets are being kept all the time. Now, I'll admit, it wasn't a question of Dr. Tyson, for example, who says the proof that we can't keep secrets is how much we know about President Clinton's genitalia, which hardly has anything to do with the NRO, NSC, et cetera, et cetera.
No, but he would be trying hard to keep that secret, I'll tell you. what he's doing with them.
I would hope. Well, I expect so. Let's put it that way. I don't have intimate personal knowledge of that. Another example of people making strange claims about cover-up, Dr. Seth Shostak claimed that the proof that there can't be any cover-up is how bad a job FEMA did on Katrina and how badly the post office is run, neither of which has anything at all to do with the question of black budgets, secrets, all those alphabet soup agencies.
Right, but you've been talking about the black budget, and I agree with you. There's an awful lot there, but where is the proof that any of it, even 1 cent of it, has to do with UFOs?
Well, if we look, it's very easy to find that UFOs are part of that story. Look at the 156 whited out NSA, National Security Agency. I know you know what that means, but not necessarily.
Yes, I know.
156 NSA UFO documents that were released, it says here, way back in the early 80s, after a Freedom of Information Act suit and all kinds of legal shenanigans. And you can read one sentence per page. Everything else is whited out, and it's whited out instead of blacked out, I was told by the NSA, because Phil Klass, whom we were just talking about, said that I show some blacked out documents and don't tell people it's, what would you call it? It's sources and methods information that's being kept back. Now, don't tell me 98% of a document is sources and methods, and the other 2% of every year when the overview came out, that, no national security concerns here.
Well, I think we're talking about, things where there were sightings on bases and things like that, but nobody has ever shown any evidence that there was any organized project to do anything with any sporadic reports that might come in from elsewhere in the military. I think they realized that if anything came in from the public, it was likely to be of very little value, that the so-called reliable witnesses are not reliable as such. In fact, I have an example of that here I'd like to talk about, and this was a UFO sighting from 1996 that occurred in the Yukon, and on the evening of December 11th of 1996, there were more than 30 people in several different locations in Canada's sparsely populated Yukon territories. We're seeing a huge UFO mothership with rows of lights, and there was the documentary film Best Evidence, Top 10 UFO Sightings by Paul Kimball, who was your nephew or something like that.
Yes.
And lists this as number 8 of the top 10. And in that film, you appear and you're saying how this is emblematic of what a good case should be and so on. I don't need to go into all that. But as you perhaps are aware, I think just within the last 6 months or so, Ted Molson, who is the world's top civilian expert on Earth satellites and orbits and things like that, looked into the matter very carefully and came up with an exact match. The observed phenomena were due to the reentry of the second stage of the rocket that placed Cosmos 2335 into orbit earlier the same day.
No way, Jose.
Well,
no way, Jose.
You can say that, but now on my blog,
well, I've got
all this stuff, and it doesn't matter if I'm just saying that if enter Yukon in the search box on bad UFOs, and the thing will come up with all the pictures that people saw, they think they saw, but again, the human eye is not a precise recording device, and especially when people are excited. And this brilliant UFO, so-called, which really was the re-entry of Cosmos 2335 rocket booster, matched exactly with the position and the time where people were claiming that they were seeing this.
Not according to Martin Jasik's report. He is a civil engineer. He did a triangulation of these, 30 sets of witnesses. They're not individuals. Usually they were couples. You can understand when you're up in that part of the world.
Yeah.
No way does it match the satellite re-entry. Lasted much longer than that, for example. And I'd recommend look up Martin Jasik's report, Jacek. Good engineer, spent time with them, very impressed. That's a typical example of don't bother me with the facts, my mind's made up. Here's a possible explanation. It must be the right explanation. It's a possible explanation. And remember the basic rule, ABA, anything but alien. If the first explanation doesn't work, try a second one. If that doesn't work, try a third one and keep going. Because we know it can't be anything strange. It's about UFOs. It's filed.
Well, if it allows you to tell where the message came from or where it was intercepted from, then it would be sources and methods. The NSA issued a statement that says the comment reports being withheld from the plaintiff are all based on intercepted foreign communications. The disclosure of these records would identify the communications that had been successfully intercepted and processed for intelligence purposes.
Are you saying that the Russians didn't notice that we were listening?
Well, they don't know what we were listening. They don't know how much we were, snooping on them and what we had successfully decoded. You got to keep them guessing on that.
Well, it's a game that's played all the time. I'll grant you. There's a big budget that goes into playing that game, not only with CIA, but it's interesting. The CIA blacks out its documents. there are some you can read 6 words on. I mean, how very generous of them that it took me 5 years to get CIA UFO documents by their estimate. But even beyond that, let's look at the work of General Bolander, Carol Bolander. He was given the unenviable task, I guess, of deciding what the United States Air Force should do about Project Blue Book. He was an Air Force general. He had nothing previously to do with UFOs. He worked on the lunar excursion module. We landed on the moon, and as he told me when I talked to him 10 years later, for once, he didn't have to work 12-hour days. Anyway, he gave an appraisal of Project Blue Book, which, according to all the official statements, was the government organization concerned with UFOs, the only one, as a matter of fact. And in October of 1969, he issued is not quite the word. It was an inside document, not an outside one, a memo in which he said we should close Project Blue Book. He said, reports of UFOs, which could affect national security, are made in accordance with JNAP, Joint Army-Navy Air Force Publication 146, or Air Force Manual 55-11, and are not part of the Blue Book system, which is a rather extraordinary statement. 2 paragraphs later, he goes on to say, if we close Project Blue Book, the public won't have any place to report UFO sightings. However, as previously noted, reports which could affect national security will continue to be investigated using the procedures designed for that purpose. Now, since 1969, I spoke with General Bollinger, incidentally. He's dead now, so you can't go. Well, maybe some people who are listening can find him, but I don't know where. I spoke with him. The example I use, I said, gee, it sounds like you're saying there are two separate channels of communication here. Ones which affect security and the other stuff. He said, yes. The example I cited, a saucer going down the runway at a Strategic Air Command base where nuclear weapons were stored. That's a national security problem because there's not supposed to be anybody there besides our guys. And he said, yes. Now, the press has never told the public that, oh, the good stuff didn't go to Project Blue Book. It's about time they did. Where's the New York Times when you need it? You know? And I wouldn't object if the debunkers would to tell the public that indeed there are sightings that didn't go through Project Blue Book, even though we were constantly told that